They say nothing in this city moves without the Baekhwa Group. But that night, the only thing moving on that rooftop was her. Because the man holding the gun wasn't my enemy, he was my blood. And the child she was carrying, the child with my exact eyes, is the reason this war exists at all. Get me a stretcher. Get me oxygen. Get me the emergency department on the line. Now. That was her voice, raw and clinical, cutting through monsoon rain, hammering the sheet metal roof of Sejong Hospital's utility building. A red beacon swept wet concrete in slow circles above us. Sirens were already climbing the streets below. She was on her knees, visibly pregnant, both hands pressing a folded coat into Minjun's shoulder wound, blood threading through the runoff toward the drain. Her hands did not shake. I have built my life on reading rooms in half a second, and I could not read that. A terrified, soaking, pregnant woman with a surgeon's stillness. That contradiction is the last image I expected to define me. 2 dry cracks split the air off frame. Her head snapped up. At the far railing stood the man who taught an 11-year-old boy how to tie a necktie. My granduncle. The onyx ring on his finger caught the beacon light. His gun rose. I did not move. I opened my hands at my sides, empty, because I had already decided exactly where I would stop. For 34 years, no one in this city knew where that line was. That night, for the first time, I let them see it. But to understand how a night shift nurse, from a city she did not grow up in, ended up kneeling in the middle of a war that began before she ever touched Korea, you have to go back 3 months. Back to the debt, back to the contract, back to the rain on the 41st floor of Baekhwa Tower, where a pen was already waiting at the right corner of the table, and I was already counting my 3 beats. Hail tapped the windows of my office that night, a slow countdown against the glass. She sat across from me, straight-backed, still in scrubs that smelled faintly of antiseptic after a 12-hour shift. 3 stacks of paper sat between us. Her father's forged debt, her mother's care home bill, and the contract. 3 years. Separate rooms, public appearances on demand. No clause for affection, no clause for children, because both of us believed a child was impossible. I did not ask if she agreed. I never ask. I said 1 sentence. The pen is at the right corner of the table. Then I began counting, the way I always count, 3 beats in my head, because I have seen men lose entire port routes for hesitating half a second past the 3rd. She survived all 3. Something shifted in me then, the way a machine shifts when it encounters an outcome it had not been built to expect. She picked up the pen. Then she spoke, and her voice did not tremble. You can buy my apartment. You can buy the place where my mother sleeps. You can buy this signature. But there is one thing you will never buy. My word. My job is telling families what happened to the people they love. I don't sell that. I had owned that room completely. She left it ajar. In the hallway after the signing, Minjun handed her an envelope. Inside was a silver hair clip, her mother's, the one with a scratch she made at 10 years old, the one I had kept in my desk drawer for 6 weeks without knowing whose it was. She asked me why I had it. I told her I didn't know who it belonged to, that I don't keep other people's things. It was the first lie I ever told her. And she knew it. I did not yet understand how she knew it. I would understand later. And by then it would already have changed everything. 6 weeks before I signed that contract, there was a night I do not remember. A gala at Sejong Hospital. A man collapsed in the lobby. My men blocked the physician on duty and took the only other person available, a night shift nurse, at gunpoint, to a dark house in Yongin, where an unconscious man lay on a long dining table. For 7 hours, under a dull yellow lamp, she ran emergency medicine she had no privilege to run. 4 lines, vitals recorded on the back of a printed sheet in her own handwriting. A blood sample she drew and labeled herself, so that if the man died, there would be at least 1 piece of paper stating exactly what she did. He stopped breathing. She did compressions on the table until he breathed again. She was thirsty. She drank from a pitcher on the table. The world tilted. Morning came. The clip was gone from her hair. I was the man on that table. I have no memory of any of it. I only know, now, that a woman I would go on to marry once put her whole body between me and death, in a house I do not remember entering, on a night someone worked very hard to erase. 3 days before the wedding, I sat across from a foreman in a container office above the Incheon yard, a man who had been stealing from me for 11 months. I let him talk himself empty. Then I placed 1 photograph on the desk, a house in the western suburbs, a child's bicycle against the fence, I asked him only what color the front door was painted. He collapsed and told me everything. People don't fear me for what I've done. They fear me because no one knows where I will stop. I believed that about myself for a long time. I was wrong about the second half of that sentence, and it would take a rooftop in the rain to prove it. The ceremony lasted 11 minutes. A civil registry office, fluorescent lights, no flowers, no music, no one holding her coat. Gloves on through the whole thing, on both our parts, hers out of modesty, mine because I have not gone without them in years. We both said yes in the flat voice of people, confirming a line in an official record. I opened the door and let her walk out first. It was the only gesture I made all day, and it was the first time she looked up at me. Then, the house in Seongbuk-dong, Hanok bones under a modern roof, and soon Nio taking her heavier bag without asking, already reciting the rules of survival. Inside my walls. Breakfast before the sky fully brightens. No one waits for anyone else. If cars arrive in the courtyard at night, don't go to the window. Certain men come and go whose names you don't ask, and if they greet you, nod and say nothing more. The one warning Sunio gave without explanation was about the staircase behind the kitchen. In this house, she told her, the best questions are the ones never spoken aloud. My wife learned every rule in a day. 7 years in intensive care teaches a person that in places where one small mistake becomes something enormous, you learn the rules first and ask why later, if you ever ask at all. My grandmother summoned her the next morning. Kang Doyoon, in her high-backed chair, one hand on her cane, inspected her the way one inspects a delivered item. Age, profession, parents living or dead. When my wife answered that her father was dead and her mother in care, something crossed my grandmother's face that I did not understand until much later. I don't need you to love my grandson, my grandmother told her. Affection is a luxury this family cannot afford. Many people in this house have died from the mistake of loving someone. She asked only that my wife stand properly beside me in photographs and never let anyone see us standing too far apart. My wife asked what would happen if one day she did more than that. My grandmother said nothing for a long moment, then told her to go to bed, that the night was cold. I did not know it then, but that silence was the sound of a woman guarding a 20-year lie. She kept her hospital shifts. It was the one thing in her new life that still belonged entirely to her. I noticed, without ever admitting I noticed, that the kitchen light came on only around the time she was due home, and that a pot of juk waited on the stove, reheated to exactly the warmth that would carry from the parking lot to the front door. Soon Nio told her only that she was following instructions. She never said whose. One night she found me alone in the kitchen at midnight, cold bread on a plate, coffee gone cold, a man who could buy the building eating a night watchman's supper. I was wearing my gloves. I am always wearing my gloves. Even holding bread, I did not take them off. I saw her clock that detail and carry it back to her room like evidence. She was right to. There is a reason for the gloves, and until the very end of this story, I would not give it to anyone. Her worn nursing shoes disappeared from the cabinet. In their place, an unopened box. Exact size, exact brand, no note. She had been saving every one for her mother's bill. I know now she stood there a long time, unable to decide whether to feel cared for or afraid that someone had catalogued even the size of her feet. That same week, her mother's care home sent not a bill but a confirmation. Every expense paid for the year. A room with a window over the lake. I did that. I never told her I did that. I did not know then how to tell her anything without it sounding like a transaction. On her bedside table one evening, I left a leather notebook, thick paper, stitched spine, and a note in my own handwriting. Since you write everything down, you should use something better. I had seen her taking notes once. At some hour she never noticed me watching. She began filling it the way a nurse fills a chart, dated, dry, no adjectives. One night, after 3 shifts, she fell asleep reading in the library, and the notebook slipped from her hands, open on the carpet. I picked it up, 3 lines on the page, the date. Today Mom still didn't remember my name. It's all right, because it's enough that I remembered. I stood there a long time with that notebook in my hands, wind moving the curtain, and I had nowhere to put myself. I closed it, set it exactly where she would find it, draped a blanket over her shoulders, careful that my hands did not touch her, and left without a sound. I did not know, standing in that doorway, that the cage I had built was never going to hold her. I think some part of me already suspected it would end up holding me instead. Less than 2 weeks later, before dawn, soon Neo pounded on her door. They need you downstairs now. My man had taken a wound that could not go to a hospital. The basement was damp and metallic. a pool table stripped bare, 3 men and 1 trembling flashlight. She asked why not a hospital. Someone told her she had 3 minutes to decide what she was going to do. I stood against the brick wall in my gloves and said nothing while she scrubbed to the elbows with alcohol from her own bag and opened a veterinary suturing kit meant for nothing human. Her hands shook until the moment they touched the wound, and then they stopped, because 7 years had taught her body to separate fear from work. My man broke at 14 stitches, calling for his mother in a child's voice, then passed out. She finished. She tied the last knot, checked his pulse, gave orders for the next 6 hours, then turned to the shadow against the wall and delivered her verdict like a lab report. He called for his mother. In 7 years in intensive care, I've stood beside a great many people in their final minutes, and almost every one of them called for their mother. I have never once heard anyone call for their boss. She walked upstairs without waiting for my answer. My study light stayed on until dawn. She had entered my house as property, summoned like a tool, and left it the only person alive who had publicly, unanswerably judged the master of it. And I let her. 10 days before the dinner that would break everything open, she began noticing things about her own body that she refused to name. The smell of morning coffee hit her hard enough that she had to grip a doorway. Antiseptic soap in the hospital changing room clung to the back of her throat. She blamed sleep. She blamed 3 consecutive shifts. She is a nurse. She knew exactly what she needed to know, and because she knew it so well, she refused even harder to consider it, because it was impossible, because I was supposed to be unable to give her a child. I believed that about myself the way I believed the sun rose in the east. I had been told it for 20 years by 6 different doctors. I had no reason then to doubt a single one of them. One night, walking to the hospital, 2 men cut her off in the alley behind Sejong. Not thieves, professionals moving to a rhythm. My car door opened before she finished registering what was happening. A knife found my shoulder, taking her place. My coat tore. My face did not change. I put her in the car without a word, and back at the house, she treated the wound herself, in my study, and to do it she had to remove my glove. My bare hand rested on the desk, absolutely still. It was the first time we had ever touched. Then came the dinner. 22 of the most powerful people in the city, my grandmother at the head of the table. The tray slipped from her hands and struck the marble floor. The room stopped chewing. I set my knife down slowly as my wife disappeared into the hallway. The woman I had married under a contract neither of us believed could ever produce a child. She locked herself in the guest bathroom and was sick until there was nothing left. She counted backward 3 times and her knees still went weak. When someone in the hallway asked if she was all right, she answered fine, in the bright professional voice she uses outside the intensive care unit. Across the table, a hand wearing an onyx ring set down a wine glass. No one noticed that hand was trembling. I did not notice it either. I was watching the hallway she had disappeared into, already counting something I had no name for yet. After midnight, from a hospital parking lot, she called her friend Simone, a lab supervisor at Sejong. Simone came with her coat over pajamas and ran the test herself, entering nothing into any system. 2 lines darkened on the strip without hesitation. Simone asked her one word, "Who?" My wife could not answer. She thought of the young and night, of 6 doctors, of how there was not a person in the world who would believe the truth even if she spoke it aloud. She slid to the cold tile floor, and Simone sat beside her and did not ask again. Somewhere in a dark corridor beyond that lab door, a man stood behind a concrete pillar. An onyx ring flashed once. He dialed. The phone rang twice. He said 4 words. "It has already begun." I did not know, that night, that my own blood had already declared war on a child that did not yet have a name. She did not wait for morning. She drove home while the sky was still dark and pushed open my study door. I was still in the clothes from dinner, tie loosened, an empty desk in front of me. She told me plainly that she was pregnant. I did not move. I did not repeat it. I did not look surprised, and I think that chilled her more than anything else could have, because it meant I had already suspected since the tray hit the floor. I opened a drawer and laid the 6-doctor file between us, unopened. I asked her for 30 seconds to give me the other man's name. She did not need them. She told me about Youngin, about my own men taking her from a hospital lobby, about the long table, the lamp, the compressions she performed while my men stood in silence, about the water she drank from a pitcher that was not right. "You don't remember that night," she said. "I do. I've lived with it for 6 weeks. I listened to every word without interrupting. Then I opened the drawer again and placed a photocopy on the desk. The Lake House entry log, her signature, clear on the line recording her departure before midnight. If you left before midnight, I told her, none of what you just described could have happened. She looked at that signature twice. It was that good. She has never signed any logbook in that house. I did not know then that the paper on my desk was a lie built specifically to defeat her. I only knew that a piece of paper had just outranked a woman who had never once lied to me, and I let it. A gray morning brought our family physician with his brown leather case. She held out her arm and watched the vial fill, unafraid, because whatever the paper would say, her body would keep telling the truth regardless. I did not know that physician would vanish within 3 days of delivering his result. I did not think to ask why a man I had employed for years would suddenly need to disappear. I moved my belongings to the far end of the east corridor. The cold returned exactly as it had been on her first days in my house. She kept working. She kept her Sunday visits to her mother. She sat alone at one end of the long table while the far seat stayed empty. I announced once that she would not leave the grounds unless Minjun went with her, and I told myself it was a punishment. I did not let myself see then that it was also the only protection I knew how to offer a woman I had just publicly condemned. Thursday afternoon, 22 people again in the grand dining room, my grandmother at the head. My wife was called downstairs, and the moment she entered she knew something was wrong, because no one would look at her. I stood at the far end, holding an opened envelope. I pulled the sheet out and threw it across the table. It slid to a stop in front of her. No biological relationship. She read it 3 times. I spoke before she could. From this moment, this woman has no connection to the Baekhwa name. Whatever has already been spent is spent. No one is to demand it back. No one is to touch her. Anyone who says her name in this house again will do it privately, with me. I told Minjun to bring the car. I did not look at her once. Halfway down the table, an onyx ring lifted a wine glass and set it down. My grandmother sat perfectly still, both hands folded over her cane, and said nothing. I have replayed that dinner more times than I can count. I exiled her with the same breath that forbade anyone from harming her. And I did not understand, saying it, that both halves came from the same terrified place in me. She packed 2 canvas bags, left the new shoes in their box, took only the notebook, because the words inside belonged to her. Minjun drove her through the rain, past the gates, to a low-rise apartment building I had arranged without telling her. Lights on, heat running, the refrigerator full, including the same ginger tea Soon Nyo made every morning. On the table, a lease paid for a year, her mother's transfer to a better facility, and in the guarantor box, a name she had never heard, because I had tried to erase every trace of her from any record carrying my name, and did not stop to consider what that erasure would look like from where she stood. She understood 2 things at once, standing in that apartment: that this was the only way I knew how to say what I did not dare put into words, and that if she sat down in that chair, ate that food, slept in that bed, she would become forever what the paper had declared her: an expense, neatly handled and closed. She set the keys on the table and walked down 3 flights of stairs into the rain. That night, with the last of her wages, she rented a room in Haebangchon, creaking stairs, a window onto a brick wall, and for the first time in weeks, she let herself cry. 3 nights that week, I sat in a car half a block from her building, lights off, arriving after she left for work and leaving before she returned. I read nothing. I called no one. I only looked up at a dark second-floor window. On the 3rd night, Minjun finally spoke. "The light's been on a while," he said. "She came home early. There are only 2 flights of stairs in that building. If you wanted to, it would take you less than a minute to reach her door." I told him the truth, the only fully honest thing I had said in weeks. If I knocked, she'd open the door, and she'd look at me, and she'd ask me exactly one question. She'd ask if I believe her yet, and I still don't have an answer to that question. I won't climb those stairs and stand in front of that woman with empty hands. The engine started. We pulled away. The light stayed on a little longer, then went dark. The letter came from the north not long after. Her mother's care payments stopped at the request of the guarantor. 30 days before transfer to a public facility. I had not ordered that. I did not know then that my own granduncle had been quietly unmaking every kindness I extended in my name, using my silence as cover. She read it and understood wrongly that even the apartment and the paid year had been a debt I'd already grown tired of. She did not cry. She folded the letter into a drawer and slept 3 hours before her shift. Sejong would not take her back either, not outright, just a full schedule and a promise to call, and by the second sentence, she understood someone had called ahead of her. She took night shifts at a small clinic in Itaewon instead, treating the uninsured because no one else wanted those hours, and her life narrowed into dusk, down a hill and dawn back up it, one shoulder against a streetlight, when she needed to stop and breathe. She kept her mother's silver clip in her hair every day. 30 days became a number she could not sleep around. Digging through a canvas bag for an old ID one night, her fingers found an envelope at the bottom, forgotten since she'd cleared her locker at Sejong. Inside was the folded sheet from the Yongan night, and a small specimen tube with a fading label, her own hurried handwriting recording the blood type of the man on that table. She laid it beside the paternity report Simone had helped her obtain. The types did not match. She wrote them out twice to be sure her eyes weren't lying to her. They still didn't match. And the truth assembled itself the way a diagnosis does at 3 in the morning. A major lab does not make careless mistakes, but a lab can be perfectly, honestly accurate about the wrong blood. If the tube sent for testing had carried my name while holding someone else's blood, every repeat would return the same answer, and no one would ever suspect it, except the one person in the world who had drawn my blood type herself on a night no one was ever meant to remember. She laughed, a short, dry sound. She had been pushed out of her own life by a piece of paper she herself held the means to disprove. She called Min Jun from a public phone and met him at a plastic table in a diner across from the clinic. She pushed 2 sheets toward him and pointed to the lines that mattered. He had been a military medic. He understood immediately, and she watched his face change. He asked if anyone else knew. No. He told her something he had been carrying alone for weeks, that the physician who drew my blood at the mansion had resigned 3 days after delivering the result and vanished from the city. She asked if he believed her. "I don't need to believe you," he told her. "Some things are true whether anyone believes them or not. And I'm going to do what should have been done months ago." He went to the house in Yongan, empty for months, dust thick enough to hold the print of his own hand on the long table. The surveillance report I'd commissioned after that night claimed all footage had been lost to a transmission failure, and he had believed it, and the believing had bothered him ever since, because the military teaches one rule: every system has a backup, and whoever installs it hides that backup somewhere a hurried man wouldn't think to look. Behind the laundry room, beneath a dust-covered casing, a small drive sat blinking in a steady rhythm. He brought it to my study that night. "There's something you need to see," he said. 40 seconds of black and white footage, no sound. A motionless man on a table. 4 figures. At 11 seconds they all stepped back at once, and a small woman climbed fully onto the table, dropped to her knees, and drove the whole weight of her body down, again and again, her head snapping back as she shouted at the men around her. She checked him, she continued. At 31 seconds her shoulders were shaking, and the rhythm never slowed. At 38, his chest lifted. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck. At 40 seconds she tipped her face to the ceiling, and her whole body collapsed forward. I played it a second time. A third time I stopped watching the man on the table, and watched only her hands, the same hands that would later stitch one of my men back together in a basement, the same hands that emptied everything they had to keep a stranger breathing. I thought of the Thursday I had thrown a sheet of paper across a table in front of 22 people and declared she had nothing to do with this family. I stood, took 2 steps, and had to brace one hand against the wall. Minjun turned his face away. In all his years serving me, he told me later, he had never seen me need to hold on to anything. When I raised my head, my voice came out as a rasp. "Get the car." I found her building dark and waited in the car until nearly an hour later, a small figure appeared at the end of the street, one hand supporting her stomach, the clip catching the streetlight. I stepped out. She stopped 10 steps away. "If you came to give me more papers," she said. "I won't take them." I didn't answer. I followed her up 2 creaking flights, and at her door I stopped at the threshold. 15 square meters, 1 bed, a table against the wall, a small burner on a mini fridge, a window full of brick, her scrub top over the back of a chair, the notebook I had given her, open beside a pen. I looked around once and felt my own jaw tighten. My hands dropped, lifted, and finally hung at my sides, because for the first time in my life I did not know what to do with my own body. I told her, in a voice broken by pauses, that I had watched the footage, that she had not been given a choice that night, and neither had I. But what happened to her happened more than what happened to me. I lost 6 hours of memory. She lost everything else. It took me far too long to understand something that simple. Afterward, I held a piece of paper and believed it instead of believing her. I told her I hadn't come to ask forgiveness, that I had no right to ask for that. I came to ask what she needed. Anything at all, I would do it. She watched me a long time before she answered. You paid a year's rent. You moved my mother to a room with a window over the lake. You bought me shoes. You bought me a notebook. You kept the kitchen light burning for a month while you waited for me to come home, and you never said a single word to me about it. I counted every one of those things. I know exactly what they're worth. But the thing I need isn't among them. I need you to believe me. Not because a piece of paper proves it. Not because a recording shows it. Because you lived beside me long enough to know what kind of person I am. From the first day, I told you there was one thing you couldn't buy. Even now, that thing still can't be bought. I lowered my head and stood that way a long time before I could speak again. Would you allow me to prove it? She did not return to the mansion. She stayed in Haebangchon, kept her shifts, and set one condition on any further test. The following morning, at an independent laboratory across the city, she drew my blood herself, in her own scrubs, disinfected the site herself, labeled the specimen herself, completed every form herself, and signed her own name in the box identifying who had performed the collection. She did not let another hand touch that tube. She carried it to the counter and did not leave until she held a stamped receipt. I sat in the waiting chair the whole hour, gloves on my knees, and asked her nothing. 4 days later, she collected the results and opened the envelope standing under the hallway lights. Probability of biological paternity, 99.99%. She read it twice, then handed it to me without a word. I read it fast, then slow, and felt my whole face come apart in silence. I did not reach for her. I did not celebrate. The first words out of my mouth were a question as cold as steel, because I already understood the size of what had been stolen from me. If this is true, I asked her, then what have I been living with all these years? 3 days later, Minjun found the man we needed. Not the physician who'd fled the city, but the oldest name in my 6-doctor file, the one who had signed the first conclusion 20 years earlier when I lay in a hospital bed after the night my older brother died. Dr. Huang lived alone now in a small flat in Yunpyong, his hands shaking with an illness that had followed him for years. He looked at me, then at the pregnant woman beside me, and did not ask who we were. He only stepped back and opened the door wider, as though he had been waiting a very long time. I placed the old file on his table and asked him one question. Who paid you? He began to cry, an old man's silent crying, and went into the next room to fight a lock on a drawer. He returned with a yellowed envelope. Inside, the original report, hospital seal, faded date, a conclusion of a few lines stating that my injuries had been moderate, my prognosis favorable, and there had never been any indication I had lost the ability to have children. I had never been infertile. His confession came out in fragments. A man had come during the 2nd week after my surgery, spoken softly, almost tenderly, and that gentleness was what made it frightening. If the boy believes he can never have children, he will never marry anyone. And if he never marries anyone, there will never be a child who grows up to be shot one day for carrying the Kang name. He called it mercy. Huang was drowning in debt. He sat with those words all night and convinced himself it was a kindness. He signed. He kept the original out of cowardice, not conscience, in case someone came looking. My wife spoke then, quiet, in the voice of a woman who has spent 7 years in intensive care hallways. People enter a hospital, carrying the most precious thing they possess, their own bodies, and place them in the hands of people wearing a coat you once wore. They can't read the numbers. They can't verify what they're told. The only thing they can do is trust. You took that trust and sold it. The price was 20 years of a man's life. Illness didn't steal those years. A signature did. At the door, I told Huang he would repeat everything he had just said somewhere else, in front of other people, and this time he would not be allowed to be a coward. News of Yunpyong reached my house before the car did. My grandmother summoned her alone the next afternoon. A dark wooden box sat on the table between them, its lid polished smooth by years of hands. Inside lay a stack of papers, tied and yellowed, the twin of what we had seen the day before. I have kept this box for 20 years, my grandmother told her. I knew it was the genuine report from the moment someone placed it in my hands. When my wife asked why she had never given it to me, my grandmother answered plainly. Because I believed keeping it from him was saving him. 2 sons and a grandson buried in 20 years. When my older brother died, I was the only grandson left, and she swore there would be no more graves. If I believed I could never have children, I would never marry, and if I never married, no enemy would ever have a Kang heir to target. She knew it was a crime. She committed it every day for 20 years. Beneath the report lay another set of documents. Older still, a shipping route diagram, a list of crates. Years earlier she had discovered that my granduncle, Kang Doyoon, was using our transport lines to move something I had absolutely forbidden, and half the house was on his payroll, so she could not expose him from within. She found an outsider instead, a long-haul driver who belonged to no one, a decent man with a conscience, and let him know what his cargo carried, meaning only for him to report it and walk away. She accounted for everything except one thing. The truck lost its brakes on Incheon Grand Bridge on a rainy night, and the driver could not get out of the cab in time. My wife did not hear the rain start against the windows. She heard her own voice, from very far away, asking for the driver's name. My grandmother said it, Malcolm Brooks. The papers did not fall from my wife's hands, because her fingers had closed around them too tightly to open. My grandmother went on, dry as paper. Afterward, Doyoon invented a debt in the dead man's name, funneled through a credit fund he controlled, so the paperwork would point to a bankrupt trucker instead of a witness. He was the one who altered the lake house log, forged her signature, called the care home, and stopped the payments in the family's name without my knowledge. From her pocket, my grandmother produced an old photograph, a man near 60, raising a glass at a party, a black stone ring on one finger. My husband's younger brother, my granduncle by blood. My wife set the papers down, asked nothing more, walked out through the foyer into the courtyard, and stood in the freezing rain a long time, face to the sky, and found she could not cry. Not one tear, only the flat, empty space she had seen so many times in the eyes of families after the worst news arrives. The call came during her night shift. Her mother had not eaten since the day before. Her breathing was changing. She should come soon. She left her scrub top mid-shift without asking permission, and I was outside her clinic in 15 minutes without asking anything, only opening the car door. For 2 days she sat with her mother's hand in that small warm room above a dark lake, talking about shifts and weather and a bakery that opens early. I never entered the room. I sat on the plastic chair across the hallway in my gloves, and every time she looked up through the glass, I was still there. On the 3rd morning, the first sunlight lay a pale gold strip across the blanket, and her mother opened her eyes, and this time the gaze was different, present, whole. Ruth Brooks lifted one hand and found the silver clip in her daughter's hair, traced it to the scratch she remembered, and smiled. "Nia, you're making me tired. Go to sleep." Then, softer, she told her about a notebook her father had kept, every trip recorded, hidden under the lining of a drawer in a sewing table in storage, and told her never to give it to anyone, not even her. She began to sing, slightly off rhythm, the lullaby from decades ago, and this time she knew exactly who she was singing it to. She sang the whole song without missing a word. My wife collapsed against the edge of the bed and cried like a child. In the hallway I rose, walked to the door, heard the singing, looked once, and turned my face to the wall so no one would see mine. That afternoon, as the lake turned the color of copper, her mother's breathing grew farther apart, and then it stopped, and my wife stayed there a long time, still holding her hand. 3 days after the funeral, she went to that storage unit and found the sewing table under a blue tarp. In the second drawer, beneath the fabric lining, a worn blue hardbound notebook, her father's handwriting slanted across the cover. Every trip for years, dates, cargo, the names of men who signed for delivery. On the final pages the handwriting changed, smaller, hurried. 3 crates not on any manifest. He had opened one and looked inside. Identification numbers, the name of the man who delivered them. And on the second to last page, one line: "If anything happens to me, this is the reason." On the last page, a sentence to his wife alone: "Hide the notebook. Don't give it to our daughter. I don't want the girl to have to carry this." She sat on that cold concrete floor a very long time with her father's warning open on her lap, carrying it anyway. That evening she gave the notebook to Minjun. He read it end to end without a word and called someone he trusted at the federal prosecutor's office. While they waited, he laid out for her the dossier he'd been quietly building for weeks, and she stopped on one page. A background review my own people had prepared before the contract was signed. Every detail of a night shift nurse's life, employment, finances, her mother's name, and on the fourth line, her father's name, the overpass, the debt. She brought that file to my desk herself and asked when I had known whose daughter she was. Before we signed, I told her, because it was true. She asked if I had searched for her after Yongan. Yes, I said. When I woke, I was holding a silver hair clip and remembered nothing except that I was alive. I had every hospital in the city checked for 6 weeks to learn whose it was. The day we found her, the file arrived, and inside it was the name connected to the man who died on that bridge. She asked the question she had been afraid to ask since the storage unit. The 3-year contract, the apartment, the shoes, the notebook, the kitchen light. Was any of it for me? Or was it all a debt you believed you owed a dead man on an overpass because he died inside a system I control? I walked to the window and stood there a long time before I turned back, and I gave her the first fully honest sentence I had ever spoken to her. I don't know. I've asked myself that question many times, and I've never dared to be certain. The two things have been tangled together from the first day. I haven't been honest enough with myself to separate them. She nodded, picked up her father's notebook, and walked out. I had spent my whole life certain I knew exactly where every line in every room. Saturday, that was the first time I stood in a room with no idea where the line was, and I understood I had lost her the same night I had finally told her the truth. Everything began to collapse before dawn. Transfer points frozen, licenses suspended, accounts locked. By mid-morning, half the men who answered to me had stopped answering their phones. Minjun read the list aloud and stopped at the 9th name, because we both understood at once. Taeho was not attacking the money. He was cutting off every route to free his hands for something else. I called her. The phone rang and rang. That afternoon she had gone to sign papers and collect her mother's belongings, and descending into an underground garage after dark, she heard footsteps matching her rhythm behind her. She did not turn. 7 years in hospitals had taught her something the men who hunt women never think about, that every large building is built to save lives, and all she needed was to know what was where. She reached a concrete pillar, smashed the glass with her elbow, and pulled the alarm. Bells screamed through 4 levels. The whole building poured into that garage at once. Staff, patients, families, security, all of it swallowing the man behind her whole. She moved against the crowd, out the rear door, into her car, and drove not home but to Sejong, the one place in the city she knew every door of. She called Minjun, said 3 sentences and hung up. Rain began as she crossed the bridge. She went around the back of the hospital to the utility building, the badge reader flashing revoked, the ground floor door never properly locked since a broken hinge 2 winters back. She climbed the fire stairs. They followed her to the 3rd floor before Minjun reached her. Then I arrived. What happened after survives only in fragments, the way violence always does. Rain hammering the roof, drowning almost every sound, the rooftop door bursting open, wind striking her face, the red beacon sweeping wet concrete in steady intervals. Minjun shouting for her to get down behind the air conditioning unit, 2 cracks, then more, overlapping with the rain. Minjun stepping in front of her, his whole body a wall between her and the man at the far end, and then his body jerking, then dropping to one knee. She was on him instantly, hands finding the wound, pressing down, her own voice counting loud and steady beside the rain. I crossed that rooftop while 2 figures struggled at the railing in silence. And another shot, closer than all the others. And then a long silence filled with nothing but rain. Below us, red and blue lights swept the street, a siren rising, a loudspeaker calling something none of us could make out. She looked up. I was standing in the middle of that rooftop, soaked through, hair plastered to my forehead, still holding something in one hand. At my feet, 2 steps away, lay the man who had taught me to tie a necktie at 11 years old, who had stood beside me at my brother's funeral, who had stolen 20 years of my life with someone else's signature. I looked down at him a long time. Across that whole rooftop there was nothing left but rain. Then I opened my hand. The gun fell onto the wet concrete with a hard, dry sound, slid a short distance, and stopped. He began to struggle for breath. I did not move. No one on that rooftop could have blamed me for standing there 3 minutes longer and doing nothing. 3 minutes would have been enough. I knew it. Minjun knew it. He knew it too, looking up at me with no pleading in his eyes, only the waiting of a man who had already calculated how his story ended. I have spent my whole life being a man no one could predict, and in that single motion of an open hand, I became, for the first time, exactly what everyone should have expected of me. She crossed that rooftop on her knees, one hand supporting her stomach, and dropped beside him without looking at his face. She tore off her own coat, folded it into quarters, pressed it down with both hands, her whole weight behind it, the way she has done hundreds of times for strangers who never once wronged her. She turned toward the stairwell and shouted for a stretcher, oxygen, the location, twice, so the people below would hear her. Then she turned back to the man who had murdered her father and began speaking to him beneath her hands. "You're not allowed to die. Listen to me carefully. You are not permitted to die here tonight. If you die, everything closes neatly around you. There will be a proper funeral. Someone will stand up and say decent words about you, and my father will remain forever, nothing more than a bankrupt truck driver whose brakes failed on a bridge. Dying like that would be far too easy. You have to live. You have to sit in a room where someone is writing down every word, and you have to say, with your own mouth, how my father died and why. I will keep you alive until that happens. Even if I have to kneel on this concrete all night." He could not speak, but he could hear, and I watched him understand her. The only thing left to him was to close his eyes. I stood in the rain and understood something no one had ever taught me in 34 years, that there is a kind of strength that requires nothing at all in your hands. When the emergency team reached the roof, she handed him over in 3 short, precise sentences, then went straight to Minjun, pale, lips going blue, and worked over him under a borrowed flashlight until the stretcher team arrived. He managed a dry laugh between 2 breaths. "At least this time we have equipment made for humans." She told him to be quiet and count backward from 20. He reached 9. I stepped toward her, took off my own coat, and set it around her shoulders. This time I did not ask what she needed. The trial opened that spring and ended sooner than anyone expected. Dr. Huang sat in the witness chair, both hands trembling, and told the whole truth of 20 years, and when asked why he had waited so long, he said only that he had been a coward long enough. My grandmother carried the wooden box into that courtroom herself, refusing anyone's arm, walking on her own cane. Taeho, who had survived exactly because a woman he had wronged forced him to survive, told the court with his own mouth what happened on Incheon Grand Bridge. Before any of that, months before the trial began, I walked into the federal prosecutor's office with my attorney and handed over the complete operational history of my family, holding nothing back. I asked for no immunity. I accepted probation, the loss of every executive authority I had ever held, supervised assets, monthly reporting like anyone else. Some people said I had lost my mind. Some said I was burning down with my own hands what 3 generations had built. I explained myself to no one, because the only explanation I had was hers. Baekhwa Group became Hanbit Medical, legal, transparent, independently audited, and 40% of its shares moved into a fund carrying the name Ruth Brooks for the nursing education of dock workers' children, the children of the very district my family once controlled. The person who signed those founding documents was my wife. Our daughter was born on an April morning. Sunlight crossing the delivery room windows. New leaves opening on the maples outside. She has her mother's warm brown skin and my gray eyes. The second person to hold her, after Nia, was Minjun, still bandaged, receiving that small weight with the exact, careful arms of a man who was once a military medic. That afternoon, when everyone else had gone home, I brought my wife up to the roof of Sejong Hospital, the place where for 7 years she had eaten dinner alone between night shifts, and where, on a black rain-soaked night, the 2 of us had faced my own blood. I handed her an envelope, the 3-year marriage contract, and beside it, a lighter. On the first day, I told her, "You asked me a question, and I answered that the contract had no clause for it. Now I have an answer. If either of us changes our mind, that person is free to leave. No debt, no conditions, no one holding them back. From this day you are free. And wherever you go, you and our daughter will never lack for anything." She held that contract a long time. What happens if I stay? She asked. I was silent a moment, then I raised one hand and removed the glove from my right hand, then the left, folded them together, and put them in my coat pocket. The first time in all those months she had ever seen my bare hands. I reached toward her slowly and placed one hand over her stomach, over the place our daughter had grown. Then, it will be the first time in your life that you stay because you want to, not because someone paid for it, I told her. And I will spend the rest of my life becoming worthy of that choice. She looked at me a long time, and then she answered the question I had never dared answer myself in that study on the 41st floor. Maybe in the beginning you came to me because of a debt, she said. Maybe that's true. But people don't keep the kitchen light burning for a month because of a debt. People don't turn their face to a wall in a hospital hallway because of a debt. People don't open their hands over wet concrete because of a debt. What something begins as matters less than what it becomes. She lit the lighter. The flame caught the edge of the paper and traveled along the clauses, and she held the burning contract over the railing before opening her hand. The ashes lifted into the spring light above the rooftops of Seoul. I reached for her, and my bare fingers found hers, and for the first time in 20 years, the man whose name once made half a city lower its voice felt something that had nothing to do with fear at all. No one in this world has the right to decide for another person how much their life is worth, or what they are allowed to hope for. One signature stole 20 years from me, one debt stole 4 from her. And what brought us back to each other was never fate. It was the day both of us were finally given back the right to choose our own lives. Believe the people who tell you the truth. Be kind even when no one is watching. And remember, trust is the most precious thing one human being can give another.